Okay, I hope the online audience can hear me. Welcome everyone to the Mobile and Wearable Health Seminar Series. And this week we have Professor Heidi Christensen. She is a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Sheffield, and she's also the head of the department. We are very honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and a very warm welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all today, and I spoke to quite a few of you just earlier today, and it's really interesting to hear all about your work. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview to some of the work we're doing in Sheffield. I thought it might be just helpful to try and categorize, if you like, a little bit some of the work we're doing. So obviously we've done quite a lot of core work on kind of speech technology and AI. We've also done a pretty substantial amount of work on data collection to kind of underpin some of this stuff. We have done all the way through, but are increasing our user engagement work. And we are thinking about some of the aspects. I'll tell you what would help is the charger, I think. In terms of the real world use and what it is we need to ask for our models for it to kind of work there. So some of the initial work we did came out of the neurologists that we work with in Sheffield. Okay, it's going completely bad. Who were observing when they were speaking and doing sort of the initial history taking on interactions with patients. They found that there were particular things in that kind of conversation that they felt should be utilized. So we looked at trying to automate some of that early linguistic analysis and then moved forward in terms of automating all aspects of it, including the doctor themselves. And so that quite early on with my first PhD student led to an automated tool that has been with us until pretty recently, working very hard to try and collect as many assessments as possible. Through that work as well, we started looking at automatic prediction of various cognitive assessments. So I think in all of our areas, there are these peripheral kind of measures that a lot of our work in terms of machine learning, I do apologize about this, we'll be kind of looking at that kind of prediction style. So we have done quite a lot of work that these abbreviations here are just different flavors of cognitive tests. And all the way through from my first PhD student, we tried to stay as connected as possible to the patients as well, working quite closely with them, but also working closely with the clinicians to really understand how would they be using a tool like this. Then we started work on looking at confounding factors. Of course, when you are working in a speech domain, you see, of course, signs of cognitive health, where you also see signs of age, depression, anxiety, and various other things, confounding factors, if you like, that also affect speech. So we've done quite a lot of work on trying to detangle that side. And we've moved on to not just looking at people with memory problems. We've done a fair bit of work on stroke survivors. So now I think I'm going to run out of, oh no, one more. Sorry. Oh, here.
And in the new world, the game that you show for the new on half of the brain.
Oh, that troubling again.
Yeah, that's probably.
Okay. I don't think I could do anything. So.
You try sharing the full desktop instead of just a single window.
Yeah, I can try. How's that look?
Good.
Good. Okay. It looked good before, didn't it, to start with? And let's hold the plugging in. So let me just click you forward to where we want to. Yeah, so I was talking about the other groups we're working with. So stroke survivors, we've just had a new grant come in where we're going to work with people with motor neuron disease, or ALS, as it's called in the US, and Parkinson's disease. It's something we've looked at for a while, but haven't yet got a lot of data for. The other thing we've started doing is looking at working with local ethnic minorities. So I talked with some of you beforehand about bias in data. So though we have regularly tried to recruit directly from clinics and try to consent everyone who literally walked through the door, we know that there are people who don't want to turn up to the doctors with memory concerns, including ethnic minorities. So we've tried to work with them and try to see what are the barriers and the kind of taboos perhaps around thinking about having a dementia diagnosis. And recently, in the last year or 2 years now, we've worked with a company, software company, to develop a kind of commercial level tool. And have started recording data more widely in the UK. And of course, throughout, oh, this is really getting a bit difficult. Throughout, we have also worked with various people who have been more interested in sort of perhaps taking a step back from thinking about commercializing and working with users, but really doing that in-depth feature exploration. And then on the sort of starting to think about how this work that has really initiated in the lab, how could that possibly one day be used for real world? So if this was going to be used in the NHS, of course, it has to be robust to various language backgrounds. It has to work for everyone, regardless of what their mother tongue is. So we're currently looking at that. And of course, also just being able to work with people with lots of different dialects and accents within the UK. Another thing I'm quite interested in is working with or seeing how we, from the global north and developing tools here, can help the global south, if you like, on kind of working with them to try and improve some of their access to medical tools. And finally, we talked a little bit about this as well earlier today, making assessments meaningful for clinicians. What do they want to see in a report that could come out of some of these tools we're looking at? And in general, sort of the wider issues of ED&I as issues in speech and language technologies. So I'm going to dip into a few of these. Yes, start with the kind of data collection side of things and the kind of science. So just a brief introduction why we're interested in this. Dementia is currently the biggest killer in the UK, so it's higher than cancer and higher than heart rate disease. And so looking at how we could early on detect problems with cognitive impairment is hugely beneficial. And you often see in the news these days as well for drugs being developed to try and slow down the progression of this disease. So there's two applications we're interested in. One is stratification of people with memory concerns in the primary clinic. So you go to your doctor or your GP and they currently now, once they think perhaps we're thinking about dementia, they refer you to secondary care. And after COVID, we're looking at a year, perhaps 18 months of wait. That's an awful lot of time. So we are hoping with a tool to be able to slow that down so that people who don't have dementia can be treated otherwise. And the other area we're really interested in is long-term tracking of people with mild cognitive impairment. So that can be a precursor to dementia. And currently what happens once you're diagnosed is you're sent back and told to come back when things are worse, which is a really difficult situation for patients and for carers. Again, it would be nice if there was a tool you could use at home that was easy to use, but pretty effective, that could keep an eye on you so that we could call you in when things got worse, but didn't necessarily need to see you earlier. So these are some of the, if you like, motivators behind this tool. So in terms of how dementia affects speech and language and conversation in general, some of these might be familiar to you. So in terms of the speech, we're looking at really physiological changes, but also changes to articulatory movement and aspects like rhythm and stress and prosody. In terms of language, and that's probably the area people are a bit more familiar with, things like reduced vocabulary size, going back to your mother tongue, once you've progressed quite a lot, which is a worry for a lot of us in this room, if we end up living in the UK forever. But generally kind of, finding problems using the accurate words, using specific enough words. And in general in conversation, and this is one of the things we're trying to really look at, general kind of lack of or difficulty in understanding what's being said, take a little bit longer to process things. On the surface, you can have a conversation, but what's being said is often what's called empty speech. which can be difficult to kind of pick up the kind of linguistic message there. And a couple of kind of famous examples. So Iris Murdoch, a very well-known UK or British author. People have looked at her books through her career and found towards the end that he just had impoverished language, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's afterwards. So I heard someone describe a review of her last book saying, oh, it's like a 12-year-old has written it, which of course is very sad. And the other famous case is Ronald Reagan, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 5 years out of office. People had looked at his unscripted broadcast sessions and found again issues with language. So I normally put these two cases up, and then I often get questions about other potential precedents out there. So of course, recently there has been quite a lot of debates about what else is going on. Some of what we're seeing, these are obviously both two elderly gentlemen, but it's difficult to know whether there's other things going on. So the tool we've developed is called CognosSpeak. It is now available for people to kind of take part in if they want to. It's been underway for probably 8-10 years by now. It consists of a series of tasks, 10-12 memory probing questions. So things like, what did you do in the weekends? Or what did you do when you left school? Picture description tasks. So typically this picture here, called the cookie theft picture, we look at how people are describing what's happening in the picture, which order they're describing it, what words they're using. Are they recognizing that this is probably the mother of the children, etc. And verbal fluency tests. So things like name as many animals as you can in a minute. Even for people with healthy brains, it's a little bit challenging. But I'll show a couple of examples of what happens when you have dementia. So I'll play this little video as an introduction to how we've automated this, the kind of digital doctor. Oops.
My name is Sarah. Welcome to CognosSpeak.
Yes.
I'm Dan Blackburn. I'm an academic neurologist, and CognosSpeak is a new tool to help diagnose dementia at the early stage, and it's based on measuring people's language and interaction, as we know that's affected early in Alzheimer's disease.
The CognosSpeak system is a test for assessing your cognitive impairment, really. So it can run on a computer or a laptop or even on a tablet, and you can take the test at home, but also at the hospital or at the GP clinic, really wherever you've got access to Wi-Fi. And the test, when you start it up, will basically have a virtual agent that will ask you some questions, and you then respond to them, to those questions, in much the same way as you.
So we've been recruiting with this new system for about a year now, and we're sort of keeping tabs on how many we want. So you'll see up here that we've had an overall target of 290, but have now recruited 800. However, most of them are healthy controls. So they are interesting, but we're really particularly interested in people with unknown diagnoses. So that, I think, is one of the things that happens when you set a system like this live. To really keep an eye on the targets can be a little bit difficult. So, as I said, almost 800 comments for the ones that come through the clinic. So mostly Alzheimer's disease, but also mild cognitive impairment and a few other things. And then the other important thing is that we also keep an eye on mood outcome measures. So PHQ-9 and GAP-7 are two well-established measures for depression and anxiety measurement. And because they're kind of confounding factors for the cognitive impairment, we kind of make use of that quite a lot. And we might get more data. So BBC came to visit a week ago, and yesterday they broadcast a news. So some of these, again, when you're starting to think about moving into the NHS and kind of having impact for users, you have to do more of this kind of stuff. Right. Just briefly summarize the kind of issues that I recognize from some of your talks this morning. Problematic labeling. We're not quite sure about the cognitive health status for everyone who's joining online or assessing online who hasn't been through a doctor. They obviously think that they're cognitively healthy, but they may not be. We now have so many assessments that it's not feasible to manually transcribe all of them. So for the automatic speech recognition, we would normally have all of it manually transcribed. So we're going to have to look at ways of semi-automatically processing quite a lot of the data. That's obviously a luxury problem. Before we didn't have much data full. Another thing that came up a couple of times when I spoke as well is the kind of unbalanced nature of the diagnosis and this truly in the wild data where we're not really sure about the quality. So I think we will need to have automatic methods for assessing some of it. However, it's a much more realistic data set than any of the data sets that's out there in general. And so, of course, it's our job to try and overcome some of this. So let me go back to look at some of the linguistic and sort of results from there. I'm just thinking about which things I will want to skip. So we want to be finished before 5. Right? So in terms of features, initial features were very much inspired by the kind of conversation analysis that came out of the work with linguists and doctors to start with. And since then, we've expanded to a whole range of lexical and acoustic and semantic features, word vector embeddings, and new features are kind of SSL and large language model based to take advantage of that. So one of the exciting bits of work we did was with Yilin Pan, that some of you mentioned, you knew. She's gone back to China after she's finished her PhD, but she did a lot of work on particularly the kind of cookie theft descriptions, tried to combine all of the available data sets and managed to train quite impressive deep learning based architectures. And this recent work was kind of using cross attention. So clever ways of trying to combine the layers in the RAF2 model. She revisits some of earlier findings, if you like, of papers where people have, for example, found that acoustic features generally were not as good as linguistic-based features, but she showed with more data and a really good setup in terms of architecture, that was not necessarily true. So I think that's one of the issues with working with relatively little data. People jump to conclusions, and once things are stated in a paper, you need to sometimes challenge these and go back and revisit. So the other bit of what we've done recently is look at the fluency naming tasks. So this is a task where you name as many animals as you can in a minute. I thought I would show just this clip from the BBC because here I'm going through 2 examples. So hopefully that's going to work as well.
Awesome. So I'll show you an example here of someone who is cognitively healthy.
Dog, cat, rat, mouse, hamster, gerbil.
Cat, dog is often the first ones, and we're guessing quite far into the recording before she starts sort of needing a second to think. So I'll show you an example here from a person who's been diagnosed with dementia.
Elephant. Worm. Dolphin.
So he's struggling to start with, then thinks of elephant. Next one he thinks of is worm. So semantically not related really. And when the doctors are using this test, they're just counting the number of correct answers, but we are also looking at the pausing, the types of groups of animals they go through. So there's a lot more.
Yeah, so these were 2 extreme examples. So the first one, extremely articulate, she just rolled through lots and lots of animals. And the second one really started by not quite sure, and then thinks of one animal and then another. So we wanted to see what kind of happens. I'm quite interested in visualizations for this. I wanted to think about what happens in terms of semantic similarity. So what people with healthy cognitive brains often do is they go through domestic animals, dog, cats, go through that. Then they have a little pause, might move on to farm animals, move on again, etc. Whereas people with MCI and dementia have a much more erratic way of going through the animals. Now, interestingly, we took the tool a couple of years ago to Kenya, did the same test there, and their animals, of course, are very different because they know all of the animals, African animals. So they started with, for us, animals in the zoo, but for them, they're not so used to having at least cats at home, but they went through many more interesting. They knew all the antelopes, etc., etc. So of course, you have to be really careful with the background of the people. We famously had looked at this with people from Grimsby, a fishing town. They know lots of different fish names there, of course. So Yeah, so this was another really interesting bit of work that has only recently been possible to do. So this is looking at the group which is mild cognitive impairment. There's two types of mild cognitive impairment, really, but when you're diagnosed, you don't know which. 50% of people will develop dementia, but you can't tell them which one it is. So the work here is to try and see if there is anything we can see in the language that could perhaps help us predict whether you're going to be in that category. And so we try to look at how this works. Now, in terms of data collection, this is only possible when you've worked with people for a long time, because of course they have to be diagnosed with MCI. Then you've got to wait till they come back to clinic eventually several years down the line. And we can then go back and say, actually, that was this flavor of MCI. We can now see that they've got dementia. So that enables us to set up a relatively small group. I think we've got 25 in each of these, and look at the kind of accuracy with which we could detect them at the earlier visit before the doctors could. Okay, so let me go through this a little bit quickly. So this is working with another group of patients, people who have survived a stroke. When you've survived a stroke, there's lots of things going on. You might be at risk of developing dementia, so people definitely want to keep an eye on your kind of cognitive state of mind. But of course, you often also have general speech problems. You also have physical problems. So in terms of their clinical needs, if we could have a tool where at least at home they could be assessed on their cognitive health, that would be very helpful. So we worked with patients there as well. And here again, progression monitoring is really important. So we try to record them immediately on the ward after they've had a stroke. And one of the things we learned there is that for some people, that's just too much. They've just had this life-changing event happen, and they're not really able to engage much with the tool. So the tool at that stage has to look a little bit different from the type of things you can ask them to do. Maybe 3 months down the line, things are sort of looking a bit better again. And one of the issues we have here as well is that one of the measures, if you like, the MOCA score, is very unbalanced. So we have a lot of people that seemingly are quite healthy, and very few people who have a MOCA score that is looking problematic. So we have a very unbalanced set of MOCA scores, and we've done quite a lot of work on trying to rebalance and model the way we could work with that. And let me skip this one, this is more of the same. This one here then is recent work. We expanded what we are asking them to do because different things are kind of relevant for this group. And again, I think that's one thing that we've learned with working with different groups. Although ever so often PhD students come to me and say, oh, really nice if we could have a tool that could work for everything. The reality is that isn't what's going to work. So stroke survivors have a very different condition to people with dementia, to people with MND. So though there will be overlap, I think the future is definitely having different flavors of tool like speak. So this work here, try to explore lots of different things. It's quite a thorough bit of work. Different ASR models, so the speech recognition model underpinning it. Different SSL-based models, so various state-of-the-art features and different classifiers. So in that way, probably not too dissimilar to some of the work you're doing here, where you're sort of sitting off everything and see what kind of comes out. And we did manage to look and find very good regression results and also classification. This is a kind of interesting area kind of to work with, because the doctors don't always know what's kind of interesting. They kind of would like an automatic tool, but it sort of depends on what we can say with what accuracy for them to think about how could I use this in clinical practice. Whereas the dementia is much more defined what they're really looking for here. It's this sort of continuous dialogue with the doctors to see where we want to go. So let me move to some of the things we're thinking about in terms of this working in real world. So I've got a PhD student, Sam, who has come in with a linguistic background, which is incredibly helpful for me because it's definitely one of the areas I know less about. So he set out, he's now in his 4th year, but to really try to see what are the effects of people using a tool like CogniSpeak with different language backgrounds. Of course, that initial thing that happens in one of these classical pipelines is that the speech recognition will be affected. So more errors will come out. What is the kind of downstream effect of that? And he's looked at how word error rate is kind of affected by where you're from in the world. And some of the recent things he's looked at is trying to simulate what happens in terms of word error rate. That's then led into a kind of quite in-depth exploration of how we measure accuracy of speech recognition systems, for example. Again, here he's really trying to get access to as much data as possible and really work around that. This I think, is a barrier to a lot of our research, that there is just, you have a great idea of what research you want to do, but you don't necessarily have the data that can kind of underpin it. So often, a lot of the preliminary work is thinking of the methodology to try and massage your data to work with you on this. Right, I'm going to, how we do? Okay, I'll go through this relatively quickly. This is a couple of years ago. A PhD student of mine was interested to see how we can predict depression and anxiety. Now, in general, and probably those of you who are from Peter Schuller's group, Björn Schuller, knows that a lot of work has been done in this, but a lot less work has been done on it in context of people with cognitive impairment. And so here, we know that both of these conditions will affect speech, and we really need to kind of untangle this. So work here is trying to see how we can try and predict the kind of cognitive impairment label, whilst maintaining the kind of or being aware of the depression and anxiety scores. And we looked at, just to start with, what is the distribution of these scores against the kind of labels, and not surprisingly, people with functional memory disorder had much lower scores, or much less affected by depression and anxiety than people with depressive related. So there is definitely a correlation there for you to kind of model. And we looked at kind of classifying this, so we could get pretty high classification accuracy, but very much depending on the diagnostic class. So I have a PhD student who will hopefully start in September. Who's going to pick up this work. We now have a lot more data. So in-depth feature exploration. Another linguist that worked with me, she did an amazing job. So she took 2 or 3 steps back from the actual system and looked at some of the data, and she took it upon herself to annotate quite a large portion of our cookie theft work, and that's been really, really insightful. So of course, us as computer scientists have a tendency to just extract lots of features and see what comes out of the kind of classifiers. But she's really worked with us to look at some of the underpinning, if you like, results there, and how that kind of influences things. So she was interested in disfluency related features, which she talks about pauses, repetition, prolongations, etc. So all of the things that happens when you're speaking naturally. We all have them, but we know there is a kind of certain profile for people with certain cognitive impairments. So she's trying to see to what degree could you extract these automatically. One thing is when she's very carefully annotated by hand, but can we do it automatically? And number 2, can we make use? And her and Sam managed to get some pretty convincing results there. Okay. So I think finally, let me think about ED&I issues in speech and language technology. So this is our second-year PhD student, Hend, who is very interested in general, in fairness, in speech technologies. She wants to eventually probably work with some of the CognoSpeak data. She's from Egypt, so she really wants to develop perhaps a system for Arabic. But to start with, she has worked with one of the big speech recognition data sets called LibreSpeech, and trying to simulate bias in there. So this is one of the kind of known methodologies, if you like. So these kind of different systems here are different distributions of male and female voices within the data set. She's looking at what happens to the word error rate. And she's actually finding that systems where you have 50-50 is the best for both voices. And even if you have a system with no female voices, that's actually not necessarily particularly good for female voices. So you've got to be really careful with how you set this up. And one of the things she looked at is there other underpinning explaining factors here. So we knew gender was a factor because we've constructed it like that. But she looked at lots of other things like text difficulty, semantic similarity, etc. And she's looking at pitch distributions now. Of course, the purpose of this really is to demonstrate that she has a good methodology going forward, but also to see if she can then develop kind of bias mitigation strategies on this area. So that's work in progress. So the whole journey, lots and lots of bits of work all the way through, focusing on different things. But of course, the impact really only comes when we kind of do the final step, which is to get it out to users, often through some sort of form of commercialization. And that in itself has a lot of work to do. So we're currently thinking about medical device regulatory approval. This is a necessity, of course, to be allowed to work in the NHS and for doctors to use it. For us as computer scientists, it means we have to be extremely careful and rigorous with things like documentation of code and the whole usage. Even from early design principles, all of that has to be kept. So it's an awful lot of work in many, many years beforehand, before you can start applying for it. You also need to have much better code. I'm sure you're all great programmers, but all the code I had in my lab was research code, of course. It is very, very different to the code that we're now working with the software company. And you have to have people that can maintain it. It's just a completely different world. And of course, you need clinical trials. So although we are collecting data in real world and has done from day one, that's very different from having a clinical trial where you, like you would in a drugs trial, say, this half of the doctors I'm working with, they get CognosSpeak, this half don't, see what happens. That's a big setup, and that in itself is probably a couple of years. So there's a lot of way to go. It's very exciting for everyone involved to see that eventually we will get there. But yeah, still lots to do, which is good. And so that is the end of this slightly rushed trip. I apologize for all of the kind of technical issues. Just to point, I know you like data here, so we are hoping to release finally some of the unpersonal or kind of neutral data eventually. Any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah.
People can see me. I'll come closer to the mic. Online audience, if you have questions, I'll monitor the chat.